welcome to another Let's Talk ASPM podcast. I'm Dana Torgerson, VP of Product Marketing here at ArmorCode. With me is Mark Lambert, Chief Product Officer, also here with ArmorCode. Mark, how you doing?
Doing good. Thanks, Dana. Great to see you again.
Great to see you as well. I know that we get together on these episodes and we talk a lot about ASPM and all things ASPM, but I don't know if we've ever really sat down and paused to talk about code repositories, have we?
I think we've touched upon it lightly, but as we've discussed before in preparation for this, it's like I don't think we went really in deep into kind of like what to do about them, right? So I think
Okay.
the topic for us to go deeper.
Perfect. Well, well, for my own sake, for some of our new listeners or folks that are new to the AppSec side of the aisle in security, what is a code repo?
Yeah, great question. And actually, I think you're right. It's a good point to kind of like do a little bit of a level set, right?
Yeah.
Because when we think about software security, we think left and right, or we think development ecosystem and infrastructure oriented ecosystem. And really, the main thing that we focus on here at ArmorCode is really bringing all of that together into a centralized platform.
Yeah.
So when we're coming from the right and we're coming from infrastructure, we're thinking about hosts, we're thinking about laptops if we're moving into endpoint, servers, data centers, also thinking about cloud. I think we should be talking about that as well a little bit today too. But when we start going further left, if you think about the code that gets out there, that
Yeah.
lives in an asset, which is a code repository. Now, a code repository, though, isn't just a single thing. It's basically a collection of files
Mhm.
and other artifacts that make up your application. Those files will have individuals will have worked on them. They will have a state. It will change frequently, often,
Okay.
and all of those things live within that code repository. So that is kind of like think about that as an asset that in turn contains a bunch of little assets.
Okay. Well, then why is it important to consider this as part of your greater security program or an element of your program?
Sure. Well, if you're developing any kind of code and that's
Hmm.
going out there either to internal systems or to external systems and customer facing applications, then obviously there's inherent, there's IP there, there's business value that's in there, but there's inherent risk there as well. So it's important to understand that a code repository exists. It's important to understand what's in that code repository so that I can really get a handle on my security posture, on my broader security posture. And also, most code repositories today, I mean, there's numbers out there that talk about, 90+% of all code that's deployed is actually made up of open source software. So it's not
Yeah.
just what's in your code repository from the point of view of the code that your teams are writing, but it's also the code that your teams are using. I'll
Yeah.
also point out with the explosion of generative AI and code
Yeah.
assistance there, the explosion of the volume of code that's being generated has also grown exponentially. So, there's a lot of risk that lives in your code repository. And when you're thinking about your security program as a whole, it represents an attack surface, it represents exposure. So it's really important that we get a handle on it and we can put it through our process and kind of really help an organization reduce that risk that it represents.
I'm glad you brought that up too. I did see just a couple of months ago from now with this recording, the CEO of Microsoft is saying, yeah, about 30% of our code is AI generated. Anthropic is out there saying, yeah, in probably 9 months' time, upwards of 90% of code could be generated through AI tools. So that just adds to the problem, I imagine.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's an accelerator, right? In the
Yeah.
same way that open source was an accelerator, that's why we have over 90% of that. It's the same way
Yeah.
as cloud was an accelerator, and organizations now, 90% of applications are deployed within the cloud rather than within traditional data centers. It's going to be the same kind of accelerator. I mean, myself personally, right? I use AI generated code to create mockups, and I'm able to get like 80% of the way there and then hand it
Wow.
over to somebody else pretty easily. So that our development teams leverage AI to help them generate the code as well. So yeah, it's a explosion of code and obviously an increase of risk as well.
Yeah. Well, then there must be an approach then. What are the things that you could do to secure the code repository? What are enterprises and orgs doing today?
Yeah,
most
sure.
of the time.
Great question. And that's the right logical thing to ask next, right? So if you think about the code repository, it's not just the code repository itself, it's what's inside it, right? That's kind of like the
Yeah.
main thing. So this is where you would leverage, standard application security techniques that we have discussed previously on the
Mhm.
webinar. So
That's right.
software composition analysis to identify where those open source libraries are, and what vulnerabilities exist within them.
Mhm.
Secrets analysis, or secrets
Yep.
detection, should I say, to find secrets that have been embedded in the code, which again leads to potential exposures. Static application security testing, where we're looking at the code and how well it's structured. That's a great example of where it's a very foundational technique that's already being used by the industry. And it applies to AI generated code just the way as it would apply to a human generated code.
Okay.
You've also got other techniques that get further right, which are kind of things like dynamic application security testing, which while it's not testing the code repo directly. It's obviously testing the underlying code because you're doing kind of external testing, things like pen
Yeah.
testing activities, red teaming also fall into the same category too. But often when I'm talking about securing the code itself, I think about the analysis that runs directly on the code and the visibility that you get out of the what's inside the box.
Code. I mean, what about code to cloud? What's that all about?
So that's a really good point as well, because so I mentioned dashed, right? That's a little further
Yeah.
right. And as things start getting further out into deployment, you're going to be deploying within infrastructure, which could be cloud. But and what you want to be able to do is you say, okay, I've found some problem in my infrastructure and I want to be able to root cause it back to the individual code. So this term
Okay.
code to cloud, though, really does box you into a cloud context. The real way of thinking about this is code to compute. Kelly, it's not just where or code to the runtime environment. That's really kind of like how we should kind of like step back and think about it more holistically. Although
Sure.
what I will say when people are talking about code to cloud, it's often they're talking about I've taken code, which is the developer written code that's actually going to do the functional behavior.
Mhm.
I'm then also writing code, which is my infrastructure as code, which is defining how to package things up into containers. Those containers are then deployed into cloud infrastructure. So being able to connect all of these dots together is
Yeah.
is really critical so that security teams can identify the ownership, identify the root causes, and really just remediate more and remediate faster.
That's a good point. If you're connecting those dots, it must be, I can imagine, not being a developer myself, but with so many developers in organizations writing so much code and all these snippets, 30, 60% of the snippets out there, some argue have malware in them. It must be impossible to track who owns this stuff, right? Of these developers?
Yeah, so ownership is a key thing, right? And then
Okay.
actually, when you think about a code repository, it's
Yeah.
not just the owner of the repository as a whole, it's who owns the individual files and who made those changes. So one
Okay.
of the things that you want to be able to do is you want to be able to take your security findings, whether they're SAST, they're CA secrets, or even these things like container security findings, and
Mhm.
trace them back to the developer that's responsible. And that's actually what we do at ArmorCode, right? So we will actually
Yeah.
take security findings coming in from those different tools.
Mhm.
SAST, SCA secrets, when you're running directly against the code repository, it's actually pretty, it's pretty obvious, right? We're going to use things like git blame to identify, hey, this
Mm.
SAST finding is on this line of code. Who was the developer that made that change? That developer goes into the finding context within ArmorCode, and that streamlines the downstream remediation workflows to identify, okay, this developer needs to, pass this information. And we augment that with all of the remediation actions and remediation guidance. When you're talking about something like a container security finding, though, what you have to do is you have to backtrace it. So you have to go
Okay.
from the container, identify the image, identify where
Mhm.
that image was created from the code
Mhm.
repo, identify how that image was created, so the IAC file, for example, and then you're able to identify the developer. So that's actually also what we do with the latest code insights functionality that we released. That's one of the things that we do is that trace back through from that container or the cloud-oriented infrastructure back to the developer itself.
That's a great example. But so if you can understand who the owner is, there's got to be some other challenges. What are some of those other security challenges that organizations face in trying to secure their code repos?
Yeah, certainly. Well, actually, first of all, starts with understanding the code repo exists, right?
Oh,
So
yeah.
actually,
The
often,
first
yeah,
first problem is to identify the problem. Yeah.
will spin up a code repository to
Yep.
start developing a microservice or something like that. and security teams need that visibility. So that's the first thing. So when you connect, or when we connect to a code repository server, so for our like example, like a GitHub,
Hmm.
we'll identify all of the code repos that are there. We'll actually also classify them if they're active or inactive or dormant based upon the amount of time since that last update was performed. So visibility is the first thing.
Okay.
Then you want to be able to map those scanners that we just talked about to the code repositories. That gives us the additional visibility of, knowing that we got those controls in place, but also being able to tie the developer ownership to those issues through that relationship. But then the challenge that often organizations face, just holistically, forget about code repositories, is
Yeah.
prioritization. What things do I need to fix first? Well, to be able to do that, you need context.
Yeah.
Prioritization context we get from our threat intelligence module for things like CVEs. We'll also get intelligence context from kind of like a CMDB or a CASM,
Hmm.
something like an Exonius or a ServiceNow, and we'll get that data and we'll ingest that in to provide additional context. But when it comes to the code repo, it's kind of a black box. You don't know what's inside the code repository per se. Now,
Hmm.
some organizations will leverage tagging within things like GitHub, and but it is very inconsistent that we've seen, especially on large enterprise organizations, and especially because
Yeah.
it's so easy just to spin one up. So, what you need to be able to do is you need to get some visibility as to what's inside the box, so to speak.
Yep. Hmm.
And that's actually, again, another thing, one of those things that we brought in with Code Insights is
Hmm.
when we connect to a code repository, we're going to inspect the code repository and identify characteristics that identify that maybe it's got sensitive data within there. Maybe there's unsafe cryptography, AI frameworks that are being used, which is really important because you're going to use AI frameworks and you want to use AI frameworks to deliver a value to your customers and deliver value for the business. But at the end of the day, you need to know that they're in place and where they are and which ones are being used. These are all things that the code repository a classification functionality delivers, basically tagging those code repositories automatically within ArmorCode, and then that information makes its way to the findings and it makes its way through the risk scoring and the prioritization, as well as giving you the ability to trigger downstream workflows and what have you.
Amazing. I'm glad to know that there's a solution that can actually help with those challenges and to be able to keep it all straight, identify the owners, know what you're dealing with, those assets. That's amazing, Mark.
And but there is actually one more thing that we should also talk about as well, because again, another difference between like code and infrastructure is that
Yeah.
code is always evolving. I mentioned that earlier, right? The code repo is a bunch of files, different files have different owners. People touch them at different points in time.
Changes.
Ownership
Yeah.
changes dynamically, which is why
Yep.
that association of ownership is really important. But the other thing is those those changes can have material code changes to the business.
Makes
And
sense.
while you'll have code reviews and things like that in place, hopefully, from a software
Mhm.
development perspective, and that's very standard. Forget security; that's just a standard course of software development processes and practices. What
Mhm.
you also would need to have from a security perspective is visibility when a material code change has gone into effect. So, have I
Yeah.
updated authorization authentication? Have I added or removed an API? These
Mhm.
things you need to kind of have visibility
Mhm.
from a security perspective so that you can ensure that basically, hey, have we done our code review? Has this particular issue been reviewed, and in essence get somebody to sign off on that, and that's required
Yeah.
for compliance requirements for things like PCI and SOX and the like.
That makes perfect sense. That actually popped into mind that you're going to have that logging and tracking for that. Yeah. Well, Mark, thank you for helping demystify these code repos. And it makes me wonder what's in your repo.
Yes, I think that, yeah, what's in your repo? I think that's a great tagline for this episode.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much, Mark. Again, I'm Dana. This is Mark. We'll see you on the next Let's Talk ASPM podcast. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.